SAS Tracking Handbook by Barry Davies, 2014. Introduction. In an age where humans rely more on technology and robotics, the potential of visual tracking seems to be an old hat, with its true value totally misunderstood. There are so many misconceptions about tracking that the art has somehow lost its attraction, especially within the military. Visual tracking is seen as a skill associated with the Native American, San Bushmen, Iban, and Diak trackers, an era in the past with no modern-day significance. Today, electronic tracking, mobile phones, and drones take priority over the human eye. Yet a few have kept the skill alive, most of whom are retired Special Forces personnel that have been successfully practiced that tracking skills during military operations. In the 1950s through the end of the Vietnam War, military commanders used the skills of the tracker to gain vital intelligence on the enemy, locate their position, and thus enable search and destroy missions. This ability to locate, identify, pursue, and interpret those signs, as well as form reasonably accurate conclusions based on the evidence left by the quarry, was invaluable. Now it is all but gone, replaced by drones and other high-tech battlefield surveillance. As modern warfare turns from raging tank battles to more isolated counterterrorism, the need for visual trackers once more becomes a relevant military skill. No terrorist can move across any terrain without leaving some type of evidence. Gathering this evidence may well mean email or phone interception, or the use of high-flying drones, but in the jungles and mountains where technology is sparse, there is still a place for the visual tracker. In such areas, signs left by the quarry can reveal much about the enemy. Historically, visual human tracking has been used by many military and law enforcement agencies in other countries around the world with a great deal of success. The ability to employ visual trackers to locate and interdict a subject attempting to elude their pursuers, gather information for intelligence purposes, or help rescue lost individuals and groups is essential. While it may not be noticeable, visual tracking in one form or another is still widespread with border police around the world, constantly searching millions of miles on a daily basis in an effort to stop illegal crossings. The tracker's art is simple. From the signs left behind, they will follow a trail and, in doing so, build a picture and ask, how many persons am I following? How are they equipped? What is their state of morale? Do they know they are being followed? Where are they going? To answer these questions, the tracker uses available indicators, that is, signs that tell if any action has occurred and at a specific time and place. By comparing indicators, the tracker obtains all the answers to his questions. Tracking started with man's need for food, to have the ability to understand what they were following and what would be the rewards if they were successful. In tracking terms, little has changed. We still track game for sport and food, but man has found other uses for tracking. Border polity, military tracking terrorists, etc. Over the years, tracking became both a civil and military skill, sadly one that only raises its head when needed. Military trackers were successfully used in Malayan, Kenya, Cyprus, Borneo, Vietnam, and Rhodesia, to name just a few. Military trackers in particular proved very successful because they were able to pass back valuable information such as strength, speed, and other pertinent information required to successfully bring the fight to their foe. In short, visual tracking is the ability to follow and locate a man or animal by observing its path by the signs they have left behind. These signs are classed as top or bottom sign, temporary or permanent, but sign can also mean direction, display habits, leave scent or smell, and many other factors that will help identify the path taken. In many tracking units, man's best friend is the tracker dog. Humans and dogs work well together and often speed up the tracking process, as dogs track by smell and not sign. Yet, more and more today, man relies on technology, and most of the world borders and war zones are inundated with surveillance drones. These eyes in the sky move very quickly and are capable of detecting a moving target from a distance. Powerful camera gimbals support both day and night observation, seeing clearly into the darkness, displaying the heat signature on a computer terminal hundreds of miles away. We slip our credit card casually into an ATM while on holiday in Asia, and immediately people have your rough location. Finally, Try walking undetected in the UK with its 4.2 million closed-circuit TV cameras, 265,000 of which are in London alone. That's one for every 14 people. As our world matures, so does the amount of surveillance. Believe me, we are all being tracked. Chapter 1. What is tracking? How is it used? The success or failure of the modern tracker is dependent on their personal skills. Training is vital in learning tracking skills, and continuous exercise is the best way to interpret sign. These skills are rarely found, but remain hidden deep within all of us. The British SAS tracked down terrorists in the jungles of Malaysia and Indonesia, while the SAS scouts and their skills in the bush of Rhodesia. Today, there are many specialist military and police units operating around the world, each practicing and refining their tracking skills. Tracking is a skill that has been passed down from generation to generation, and to some degree, it takes place every day. Most people are completely unaware of the amount of tracking that takes place around the world. Apart from hunting skills, the main use of tracking today is to track down humans. This may mean protecting our national borders against illegal immigrants, looking for terrorist training camps in the desert or jungle, or trying to locate climbers lost on an inhospitable mountain. No matter the reason, the basics of human tracking remain very similar to as they did thousands of years ago. Then, there is modern-day tracking, which uses sophisticated electronic devices to aid in finding the whereabouts of an individual no matter where they are in the world. While this is still referred to as tracking, it is a completely different science. Today, thousands of individuals are tagged for tracking because they have committed some form of criminal act. Governments attach small and in some cases minuscule tracking devices onto a car or even on the individual so that their whereabouts can be tracked without even leaving the office. Most people relate human and animal tracking to the forest and wilderness, or some war zone in a far-off land. While this is basically true in the real sense of tracking, but we also track people in urban areas and the cities of the world. The normal signs left behind by man and animal do exist, and if they do, they are soiled by the multitude of people living and working in a close community such as a town or a city. Yet in the cities, tracking is possibly more prevalent than in the wilderness. Some criminals are fitted with electronic bracelets on their ankles so that their whereabouts can be tracked at all times. CCTV cameras monitor most city centers and major highways, and many vehicles are fitted with GPS trackers in case they are stolen. For those that travel, our passports become ever more sophisticated as electronic chips are introduced, allowing governments to identify our international travel. More and more we hear of drones flying silently high above us, transmitting live images to some control room thousands of miles away. This type of tracking is on the rise and will continue to dominate our lives in one form or another. We have only to look at the current world news to see the extent of surveillance being undertaken by various agencies. Presently, the United States of America is under severe pressure from Europe to explain why it is monitoring the conversations of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel and other world leaders. They claim it is to protect the citizens of the United States and its allies, though few believe that is the real reason. Tracking and listening in to mobile phone conversations has been common practice for many years, and it makes no difference who you are, royalty, the president, or someone who is a danger to society. Those that track the location of your mobile do so by triangulation of the phone masts your mobile is close to, or, in some cases, accessing the GPS location in your phone. They sit in one of the many offices run by the NSA, or their little sister, GCHQ in UK, or their sub-monitoring office in Oswestry, Shropshire. Mobile phones have become very sophisticated, as have the apps designed to run on them, and we are all hungry to have the best and latest of both, but in doing so, you run the risk of being tracked. GCHQ has many listening sites all over the United Kingdom and has extremely close ties with America's NSA. I always tell my students to think about the things they do every day and explain how we all track subconsciously. For example, if you drive to a supermarket parking lot, you drive on the road and down a market lane to select any empty spot to park your car. You leave your car and head for the store entrance, which is clearly obvious. Nevertheless, you are actually tracking. Why? Because you would not suddenly turn off the highway and drive over a water ditch and through a fence to gain access to the supermarket parking lot. Although technically it would be a shorter route, it was full of obstacles. Once in the lot, you do not deliberately plow over other vehicles to find a parking space. And, to top it all, there is only one way into the supermarket unless you can walk through walls. Tracking in the wild is little different, as your target, unless deliberately trying to avoid being tracked, will do the same. They will take the most logical route, the obvious opening, and the clearest, easiest course open to them. It is only when your quarry suspects they are being followed that they may choose to do things that will throw you off the scent. Military. The military has used human visual tracking skills for many years. In 1755, a New Hampshire captain by the name of Robert Rogers recruited retired local soldiers and formed them into a militia which became known as Rogers Rangers. Most of the recruits were local frontiersmen who had a good knowledge of the local area, added to which they were all skilled trackers. They were employed by the British against the French and patrolled from outpost to outpost, looking for signs of enemy activity. Many times they would follow a trail and engage the Indians supporting the French in combat. Their excellence at long-range patrolling laid down many of the modern rules soldiers refer to as standard operating procedures. When the American Revolution started, many of Rogers' Rangers joined up to fight against the British under the leadership of John Stark and eventually became part of the Continental Army. Modern visual tracking came to the fore in the late 1960s in the jungles of Borneo. This means of locating the enemy lasted well into the Vietnam War and then started to decline. Today, few military units actually practice the art of human tracking, and sadly, it is a dying skill. Those that do continue with the skill tend to concentrate on either thick bush or jungle tracking in areas where human presence is fairly scarce. In many military operations, soldiers are alert for signs of enemy activity. These signs help the soldier become aware of the enemy's presence and therefore give them time to react. The skill of tracking also allows a soldier to follow the enemy after contact has been broken and take the fight to the enemy's camp. During the Rhodesian War, the SAS scouts were very skillful at doing this. SAS scouts, the front runners of modern-day visual tracking with a proven track record against an enemy in extremely hostile terrain. When it comes to military tracking, the SAS scouts, 1 SAS regiment, were one of the most successful units ever. They were mainly engaged in a wide range of operations from what was known as fire force actions on open battlefields to clandestine missions deep within enemy territory. This ragged-looking force actually consisted of highly professional soldiers who showed exceptional courage against a bitter and unforgiving enemy. At the height of the war in 1976, the SAS scouts numbered some 700 men. They worked in small units of 4 to 6 men who would parachute or heli-hop into the bush in hot pursuit of Zipra and Zanla guerrillas. The SAS scouts were lightly equipped, carrying mostly ammunition and water that enabled them to quickly track and close in on the fleeing guerrillas. Once spotted, the scouts would call for soldiers of C Squadron SAS, Rhodesian, to parachute forward towards the guerrillas in order to cut them off. The SAS scouts' methods were so effective that they accounted for killing more guerrillas than the rest of the Rhodesian army put together. Along with the Rhodesian SAS, the SAS scouts were disbanded in 1980 when Prime Minister Ian Smith handed over to Robert Mugabe's government and Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. One of the SAS scouts made their way into the South African Army. Or most of the SAS scouts made their way into the South African Army. Author's note, Captain Dave Dobson was one of the most outstanding officers of the Rhodesian SAS, having taken part in almost all of the actions during the conflict. In March of 1977, the Rhodesian military decided to deal with a strong Zanla, Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, garrison numbering some 100 terrorists, based 1 kilometer south of the town of Chioko in the northern Mozambique province of Tete. A and B troops of C Squadron, Rhodesian SAS, numbering 22, all ranks in total, were given the task of carrying out a raid on the terrorist camp. At dusk, on the March 22nd, the assault force, under Captain Dave Dodson was inserted by helicopter in 2 lifts from a forward base at Motoko. Having been dropped approximately 17 kilometers west of their objectives, Captain Dodson and his men moved off to an LUP in some thick undergrowth about a kilometer's distance away from where they lay up until the moon appeared. Marching throughout the rest of the night, they halted just before dawn and lay up until dusk on the following evening. At 2300 hours on March 23rd, the force moved up to its objective. In the distance, coming from the direction of Chiyoko, they could hear music and singing, which indicated that a major celebration was being held in the town. Captain Dodson sighted a 3-man 60mm light mortar team whose task was to shell Chiyoko and its police station so as to prevent any attempt at reinforcement from the town during the attack on the camp. The camp itself consisted of a parade ground surrounded by barrack blocks on the 3 sides, with the guard room being positioned nearest the town on the northern side. Between the buildings and the wire perimeter laid a series of defensive bunkers. The groups moved to within 500 meters of the camp, setting up a mortar position. As the 4 assault groups moved past the mortar position, they dropped off their packs and quantities of mortar bombs before moving up to a 3-strand perimeter wire fence and taking up their positions. Just before first light, Captain Dodson's and Sergeant Ian Bowen's groups slid the wire and positioned 10 claymore mines along the back walls of 2 barrack blocks on the western side of the parade ground. At the same time, Corporal Nick Breitenbach was setting 8 more claymores on the northern corner of the camp. The attack was launched at first light. Corporal Breitenbach's claymores were initiated first, followed a split second later by those of Sergeant Bowen. At the same time, Corporal Frank Booth tossed 2 fragmentation grenades into a bunker holding a number of terrorists. The 4 assault groups then commenced their advance through the camp, firing at everything that moved. Having cleared the barracks buildings, they turned their attention to the terrorist defensive positions, which comprised a network of trenches leading from inside the camp to outside the wire fence. The assault group threw grenades and bunker bombs, 1-kilogram explosive charges fitted with 4-second fuses, into the trenches as the terrorists attempted to escape from the camp unseen. Some of those who succeeded in doing so encountered a stop group positioned to the north of the camp, which picked them off. Meanwhile, the 60mm mortar team was bombarding Chiyoko from where Frelimo, front of the Liberation of Mozambique troops, and Zanla, terrorists, were firing at the SAS. Sergeant Andy Chate's assault group approached the camp from the south. Crossing a gully via a makeshift bridge, he and his men moved through a field of maize until they came under fire from terrorists in a trench to their front. These were engaged with AK-47, fragmentation grenades, and an accurately thrown white phosphorus grenade, which exploded in the trench. Those terrorists not incapacitated by the burning phosphorus were dispatched as they fled. While clearing the trench, Sergeant Chate and his men came under fire from an RPD light machine gun, and shortly afterwards he was seriously wounded in the thigh, suffering a ruptured femoral artery. Enemy fire, including shelling from some 75mm recoilless rifles sighted in bunkers nearby, prevented the SAS medics from carrying out emergency treatment until they had moved him to cover behind some buildings. A medevac helicopter was called, and this arrived a few minutes later. Unfortunately, the medics' efforts were in vain because Sergeant Chate died during the flight to Salisbury. Shortly afterwards, the SAS withdrew, leaving a scene of destruction with at least 38 Zanla terrorists dead and a large number wounded. They made their way over a distance of a few kilometers of an LZ, from which they were extracted by helicopter under cover of 4 RRAF hunters. The operation had been entirely successful, and the enemy abandoned the camp. Law enforcement and border agencies. Borders exist to outline the territory held by each nation. In a few cases, these borders are disputed between neighbors, but generally most are settled. As each country has its own laws and policy, some have become richer than others, and so for many years, wars have been fought as one country tried to possess the wealth of their neighbors by force. In addition, some countries have relatively low taxation on certain items, and this, in turn, causes some individuals to use this in order to make money. Smugglers are a good example. In the main, smugglers have been replaced by drug cartels that wish to traffic their goods over borders in order to make exceedingly large amounts of money. Finally, we have international and state terrorism. These groups use borders in order to infiltrate a country or to seek a safe haven on the other side. In order to prevent these incursions, most countries have border agencies whose task is to stop any illegal infiltration by foreigners. These agencies have a whole host of methods, including regular patrols, ground sensors, and drones. In certain countries, trackers are employed to follow up and border breach and pursue the offenders. The use of tracking within law enforcement agencies is directed mainly at border security and to stop the influx of illegal immigrants, of terrorists using isolated areas to cross from one country to another. The problem of border security is an increasing problem as people from the poorer nations try desperately to move into countries which offer a much higher standard of living. Additionally, in many parts of the world, certain border areas are used by terrorists or revolutionary groups to pass unnoticed and carry out attacks. While borders are patrolled in a wide variety of methods, many are mainly dependent on the terrain and the inhospitable environment. For example, large expanses of desert with no clear demarcation lines, no habitation, and little food and water to sustain life go unchecked. The same goes for very large mountain ranges which are covered with snow the entire year round, or the territories in the Arctic Circle. In such isolation, where humans find it hard to survive, there's little point in spending manpower to check the borders. Where human habitation is plentiful, the borders can see a lot of activity. Authors note, in 2005, Muslim militants in the south of Thailand detonated some 65 bombs in a period of less than 6 months. Some were aimed at schools, others railway stations, and local police stations. It is suspected that many of the bombs were actually made in Malaysia and infiltrated over the north border with Thailand. The attackers tended to detonate a small bomb to draw officials to the scene and then use a mobile phone to detonate a second bomb intended to kill or injure the security forces attending the scene. In many cases, the attackers simply slipped back over the border into Malaysia. For this reason, security has been stepped up on both sides, with special forces being drafted into the area to carry out follow-up missions when evidence of illegal border crossing has been found. Mountain rescue involve both human visual tracking as well as the use of search dogs. Mountain rescue. Search and rescue, SAR, is an obvious place one would expect to find human tracking skills. Yet the amount of training in this art is fairly limited, with search parties relying on local knowledge of the ground or the use of tracker dogs. The aim of any SAR is to locate, stabilize, and extract it, and people who have become lost or in distress. I think that should say any people. This means those lost in the mountains, covered by an avalanche, or lost at sea. Most SAR teams are comprised of local volunteers who know and understand their own backyard. This makes it easier to understand where the casualty might be located. In addition, many SAR teams will have access to helicopter use, either for providing aerial observation and final extraction once the casualty has been located. Hunters and gamekeepers. Hunters and gamekeepers have always used tracking skills, albeit in the role of tracking animals or birds. This skill continues and, while it is not related to human tracking, the basic principles are the same. Many gamekeepers or ghillies practicing tracking as a part of daily life and come to recognize sign as if it were second nature. Hunters remain one of the last bastions of visual tracking. The ghillies' use of tracking is almost always to define where an animal has gone in order that it can be hunted. Today, this is mainly used for sport. Yet tracking a herd of deer is the easy part. Sneaking up on them can be sometimes impossible. Animals are far more aware of their surroundings than any human. They can smell and sense humans from a great distance, and trust me, they are always on the watch. Hunting is a sport carried out around the world, normally in areas festooned with one form of wildlife or another. While hunting originated from the need for food, sadly today it is more for obtaining trophies. Ecologists and educationists. There are many outdoor activity groups that remain keen on learning the value of human and animal tracking. Certain people have a yearning to learn the oddest of skills, especially those which involve the great outdoors. You find groups which like bird or animal watching, while others will take a sea voyage to observe the whales. This observation is the basis of all visual tracking, as each, in their own way, provide an insight to both human and animal behavior. Once again, modern techniques are employed when it comes to tracking animals. Everything from whales, foxes, turtles, penguins, and a host of other species are constantly monitored from some cozy office once they have been tagged. In many cases, such as tigers, this type of tracking is done to help preserve the species and ascertain their actual numbers. Authors note, from 1998 to 2003, I personally taught human tracking to a wide variety of groups. In particular, there was an outdoor group from Belgium that came annually to learn and practice their tracking skills. The group consisted of mainly men whose occupation ranged from office workers to policemen. They were extremely dedicated and worked hard for the 2 weeks of the course. Many became extremely skilled and were able to follow a track that I had made by simply walking through the bush and open ground without deliberately leaving any clear identification markers. Given that the terrain and weather in high summer is extremely difficult to work in Spain, they succeeded in most cases. The course notes can be found at the end of this book. Tracking terrain. Any form of tracking will differ with the type of terrain over which the visual tracker is operating and in what context. That is to say, a hunter tracking a deer in the forest of Canada will have different priorities than that of a soldier tracking an enemy through the jungles of Asia. Conditions such as weather, age, climate, etc. will all have an impact on the sign which is needed to follow a quarry, as will the type of terrain. Tracking in the snow is a lot different to tracking in the rainforest. Desert tracking. Tracking in the desert has several good points and several bad points. In the desert, for instance, your field of vision is vast, and it is fairly easy to see where someone has trodden. However, the loose, sandy conditions do not leave a clear imprint, except in certain circumstances where the sand has higher clay content. While any quarry within a distance of several miles can be spotted in open desert, the heat haze can be a horrific strain on the human eye. Desert trains present wide, clear terrain. However, any spoor can be quickly covered by wind. Direction of travel is fairly easy to establish if you have good maps. As no one wanders aimlessly in the desert, they are always heading for some form of civilization. Temperature is another factor. By day, the desert can be extremely hot and at night extremely cold. This tends to annul the use of dogs during the day, but they can be very effective at night. It is normally much easier to move at night, as the stars supply a constant navigation guide. Additionally, in a military environment, your security is far better in the dark. Be aware that sound travels over great distances in the desert. The upside of desert tracking is the distance at which spoor can be seen. The picture above clearly illustrates this. The problem is this action works both ways and is easy for the quarry to see their tracker in pursuit. Another downside of desert tracking is the transient nature of any track left behind due to the wind. Once again, this will depend on the type of desert you are crossing over. Some are permanently shifting due to the prevailing winds, while others hardly move at all. When tracking over desert terrain, remember that the quarry will be heading for a specific location, as the survival needs of both man and animal are vital to life. Water holes and safe havens are few and far between, and their locations are well known. With this knowledge, the visual tracker can forge ahead with a clear indication of where the quarry is heading. Tracking across the desert is not as easy as one might think. While there are very clear marks in sand, it is almost impossible to read the footprint sign. Additionally, the sands move all the time. Where the desert turns to rock, the chance of seeing footprints is infrequent. The sun can be a good sign if it is in the right direction, as reflection from any metal object can be seen for many miles. In the desert, it is essential to keep sand and stones out of your boots or shoes. It can be very frustrating and demoralizing to be forced to stop repeatedly to empty them. Stay covered up to avoid sunburn. While it is best to rest in the heat of the day and move at night across the desert, this is not always practicable for a tracking team. However, it is possible to track at night using the moon and stars, which supply not just light, but a constant navigation guide. Arctic tracking. Many of the techniques that apply to the desert also apply in Arctic conditions, but in reverse. You need to dress according to the climate conditions and pay particular attention to your feet and warmth. Survival is equally as important as tracking in such a harsh environment. Moving over a snow-covered terrain leaves lots of sign which are easy to spot from a great distance, added to which they are easy to track at night. This makes no difference if you are tracking over tundra or lower down in timber country. Your quarry is going to be either on foot, which will make them extremely slow in deep snow, or using snowshoes or skis. The main drawback to Arctic tracking is the extreme temperature, which, while helping to preserve sign, also makes it difficult to operate. Fresh snow falls will also cover any tracks quite quickly. As with desert tracking, the quarry will normally have a final destination in mind, as it is hardly possible to sustain life outdoors for any length of time. Shelter and warmth are critical to survival, and therefore the quarry will seek the best avenue which will provide this. The visual tracker must anticipate these prerequisites and use it to gain ground and close the distance between himself and his quarry. One other important factor is the weather, as shelter is a real must as the day grows old and the nights become unbearably cold. Jungle tracking. The one environment which lends itself to visual tracking techniques is the jungle. The reason is simple, as any quarry moving through the jungle must either stick to the locals' tracks, most of which are single file, or head through the jungle forest. In either case, there will be lots of sign to follow. It is hardly ever possible to travel in a direction line through the jungle. Most quarry will make use of streams or rivers, game trails, dry water courses, or ridge crests. There may be native paths, which offer an easy path, but also make it easy for them to be followed. The alternative is either cutting away through the vegetation, which is exhausting and slow, or learning to move slowly without cutting, bending, or twisting your body so that it does not become entangled with the many spiky plants. Travel in dense jungle can be very slow. 1 kilometer per hour would be a very favorable speed, and 5 kilometers in a day would be very good progress. Jungle paths and trails become the animal's highway at night, so do not use them outside the hours of daylight. Stay in your camp area. Few humans move through the jungle at night, as the animal and natural hazards are too great. There is additional discomfort to the visual tracker moving through the jungle, from leeches, insects, and a host of nasty things like snakes and poisonous plants. These not only cause discomfort, but they can distract a visual tracker from his task. While tracking in the jungle is fairly easy, in the military environment, it is also prime territory for ambush and booby traps. Alien sounds and smells are also much more prominent in the jungle. Urban tracking. Most of the world's population lives in cities, towns, or villages, the majority of which are constructed of concrete, hard surface material which leaves little or no footprint behind. In this concrete jungle, both human and animal tracking prevails. Not only does it prevail, it is carried out on a massive scale. Where we once used the human eye and instincts to track our quarry, we now use highly sophisticated surveillance technology. Literally billions of CCTV cameras around the world monitor a wide variety of tasks, from traffic to street crime. Computers cross-reference data while government agencies communicate and exchange intelligence on a terrorist group. Those that are special interests get the full treatment, with their cars, homes, and offices being bugged while the individual is constantly tracked by one device or another. If you look deep enough, we track just about everything from credit cards, parcels, to mobile phones. There is no escape. Summary: visual tracking, in its true form, is a primeval skill which has changed little today. As with so many of man's earlier skills, they have been taken over by civilization or discarded for more modern electronic techniques. Yet we all continue to use some form of visual tracking in our everyday life. As we walk to the shops, we avoid other people on the street. We have a path to walk and a destination to get to. In essence, we are visual tracking. No doubt there are still some isolated tribes in South America, New Guinea, or India that survive due to their visual tracking skills. Even the Iban of Borneo still practice hunting in the jungle forest despite having televisions, fridges, and sending their children to school downriver every week in longboats. Then, there are the dedicated few in America and Europe, mainly retired soldiers, that maintain the skill of visual tracking for their own enjoyment or hunting. When it comes to successful visual tracking, it is not enough to just follow the sign left behind the quarry. These signs must be interpreted in order to gain an understanding of the quarry's movements, in order to foresee their final destination. One thing is for certain. There are few people on this planet that can hide away and never be found. In our everyday life, we leave a trail so clear that anyone with the right access or equipment can easily know your rough location to within a few meters.